Anissa uh, Hosenjad. Okay, cool. Is an Iranian artist and filmmaker. Her film and video work focuses on issues of displacement, immigration, and the militaristic U.S. imaginary. Her research is centered on East Asia as rendered through by Western media and its frequent collaborator, the U.S. military-industrial complex. She's a current MFA candidate at Temple University's Film and Media Arts Department and holds her BFA from Massachusetts College of Art and Design. Her work has been shown in screenings and local festivals. That was our time from the last panel, or the last paper. Screenings and local festivals in Boston and Providence, including Yoni Fest and Todo Bajo Control. Did I do that right?
I think it's Todo Bajo, but I think it's fine. Yeah.
Okay. There we go. Floor is yours.
All right, great. Thank you all for being here. Thank you for all the panelists who've shared their work so far. It's amazing. And thank you for organizers for organizing this. I'm going to talk really fast, so I'm really sorry about that. But hopefully trying to get through all of this. Tehran 2020 is an Israeli espionage thriller television series created by Moshe Zonder, writer and producer of the 2015 Netflix original series Fauda. The series was originally created for the Israeli state-owned television channel Kan 11 and premiered in Israel on June 22nd, 2020. The show was then bought and released by Apple on September 25th as an Apple TV Plus original series. I first learned about this show through a promotional email I received from Apple that read, "We can watch Tehran, your new spy obsession is now playing on Apple TV Plus." Having not been back to Tehran since I left the country 10 years ago, I was intrigued. The banner attached to the email portrays Tamar Rabinian, the Mossad hacker and agent who travels to Tehran under a false identity to destroy Iran's supposed nuclear reactor. In the banner, she's standing underneath Azadi Tower and Museum, a famous landmark in Tehran. In the image of Tamar, one can notice a smoke of explosion that is reflected in her sunglasses. In the reflection, we can also locate Milad or Tehran Tower, the 24th tallest freestanding structure in the world, and a great moment of nationalist pride for all of us Iranians. The image of the explosion in close proximity to an Iranian museum and cultural site brings to mind the now redacted tweets of the former US president in the aftermath of Qasem Soleimani's assassination by US in January of 2020. The tweet was in response to the possibility of Iran's retaliation for Soleimani's unjust assassination, which read, "The United States targeted 25 Iranian sites, some at very high level and important to Iran and Iranian culture, and those targeted and Iran itself will be hit very fast, very hard." Though Tamar in the show never manages to succeed in her mission that would result in the explosions depicted in this image, nor does she ever visit Azadi or Milad Tower, the implicit threat to Iran and Iranian culture and Iranian culture and sovereignty exemplified in these in this image looms large over the show. Tehran was set to be released globally through Apple TV Plus at the end of September. According to Apple's own website, residents from 166 countries can access Apple's App Store and products. Amongst the 28 countries that are exempt from this access are Syria, North Korea, Sudan, Cuba, Libya, Palestine, and Iran, many of which face trade sanctions from the United States. Apple's products, due to sanctions, are not sold directly in Iran, though they are imported by independent seller. This is an image of a dupe Iran Apple Store. However, on March 15, 2018, Apple implemented a total block of traffic coming from the country, and iPhone users in Iran discovered that they were no longer able to access Apple's App Store. This exclusion of Iran and Iranians from access to globally distributed products is nothing new. The lack of access to Tehran by the viewers who are also its most depicted subject calls into question the capitalist notion of the global and serves as a reminder of the hollowness of the show's proclaimed multiculturalism in production and distribution. In response to an interview question, how real is Tehran, the show? Sean Tube, the Iranian-American actor who plays an Iranian military agent in Tehran, said that we have been blessed to be part of 3 different cultures. The show was a love fest that came together, and the world will enjoy the series. Tube's response does not give us any insight into the reality or authenticity of Tehran or any of its situation or setting. Instead, the show's espoused multinationalism becomes here a signifier of authenticity or a substitute for it. The multinational quality of the show was emphasized time and again in interviews by the producers, actors, and the creators of the show. Filmed in Greece and Israel with a cast that is a mix of Iranian diaspora and emerging Israeli actors, and funded by Israel, US, and Canada, the show is indeed a multicultural, multinational love fest. The one country whose exemption from this love fest feels very present, however, is Iran and Iranians who live in Iran. Youssef Bakr, in presenting his research in conference held by a Center for Iranian Diaspora Studies, summarized his main thesis as follows. Iranians are racialized as Muslim. The racialization of Muslims is about asserting Western liberalism as a universalist idea, that the racialization of Muslims in this current conjuncture is about creating legitimacy for a neoliberal state that is masquerading as liberal. And lastly, to avoid anti-Muslim racism, many Iranians distance themselves by asserting differences such as we're not Muslims, we're not bad foreigners, and thus, as a strategy to avoid racism, they actually reify the very racial project that they want to avoid. I have to go back. Speculations like who are Iranians and what is their country like have transitioned into a new rhetoric. This change is almost exclusively in the form of separation of Iranian citizens from their government. This rhetorical change is in part thanks to Iranian diaspora's attempt to avoid anti-Muslim racism and the governmental addresses from Western countries to the Iranian public that differentiates between the people living in Iran and the Islamic Republic that governs them. Barack Obama was the first US president who started this form of presidential address in 2009. Though his first address during Nowruz, the Iranian New Year, was directed to the Iranians and the Iranian government, it was nonetheless titled as the president's message to the Iranian people. By the last years of his presidency, Obama directed his address to only Iranian citizens and Iranian American patriots, as he called them. Though these addresses were a huge step in opening up political discussions between the two countries, one that, according to some, resulted in the JCPOA, or better known as the Iran nuclear deal, it also helped further separate the Iranian public from their governing bodies in the eye of Western public. This distinct differentiation is the spirit with which the creators of Tehran approach the show. Dana Eden, the co-creator of the show, refers to their vision of the show as follows. This show is all about humanity. We really wanted to show the other side of Iran outside of the politics, outside of the regime. The world of young people, of the culture, of the music, of the human beings who want to be free. And I think that we really try to make an authentic glimpse into the current way of living today in Iran. The emphasis on showing the other side of Iran and the Iranian culture, the separation of the show from politics and people of the Iran from their governing body is put forth by actors, producers, and the creators of the show. I have to note here that the separation of politics that the creators of the show mentioned seems a little odd for a show whose premise is built entirely around the incredibly political rhetoric around Iran as a nuclear threat. In a way, the show's political narrative and ethos is quite uncomfortably close to that of Netanyahu's and the Israeli government. Nonetheless, with this presumed separation from politics and the Iranian government, that they call the regime, an aura of authenticity is given to the show's depiction of Iran and Iranians. Consequently, it is only when the Iranians are against their government, of the government of their country, that we as spectators can empathize with them in the show. that all leads to the show's painting of Iranian nationals, two Iranian nationals, the good ones which want freedom of their country and we can empathize with, and the evildoers that fight for their sovereignty and are usually sexist and anti-liberal. This forced nationalism puts into question the objective humanity with which the Western governmental officials address Iranians and the showrunners of Tehran want to portray Iran. An era of excitement followed the show in its reception in the US. Magazines like Foreign Policy called it nuanced, sometimes humorous show about Israeli-Iran relationship that floats stereotypes, and the New York Times called it unabashedly entertaining. The enthusiastic praises of the show from Western media brings into mind the perception of Fauda. Much like Tehran, Fauda was received in the US with enthusiasm for its nuanced depiction of Israeli-Palestinian conflict. However, the show was heavily criticized by the Palestinian-led movement Boycott, Divestment, and Sanction, BDS. BDS activists released a statement about Fauda, calling the show anti-Arab racist, Israeli propaganda tool that glorifies the Israeli military's war crimes against the Palestinian people. Daniel Sirkin, the co-creator and the director of the show, talked about the elements of reality that were implemented in the show. He said, working on Tehran, I learned about the deep and amazing culture, full of poetry, amazing cinema. I learned that the Iranian people are one of the most literate people on earth. Also, what I really learned was about the young people of Iran. So we started watching a lot of TV shows and movies from Iran and just regular YouTube clips of young people. I found out that there's a whole culture of skaters in Iran, something that I would have never imagined. It's too bad that he didn't know about the amateur parkour group that my friend and I started back in high school. I bet it would have been a great source of inspiration for him. He continued that this is something I would love people to learn from Iran, and we showed it. It's not a National Geographic show, but watching Tehran, you learn so much about Iran. Sirkin is right. The show is filled with symbolic imageries that signify the overconsumption of a specific anti-government media that is projected outside of Iran. Throughout the 8-episode series, there are a lot of protest footage, slogans of freedom that for any Iranian like myself who lived through the 2009 uprising sounds eerily familiar and disingenuous. Images of a young woman asking for equality and defying the rule of hijab, and indeed raves and underground parties. However, the plotline of Tehran relies heavily on flattening of the ethnic and religious diversity of Iranian fabric. The nuances of a country with an amazing ethnic and religious diversity has been boiled down to binary politics of those who rule and those who revolt. For example, Iran is home to the largest Jewish community outside of Israel in the Middle East, with a population of 15,000. Although this number is also getting smaller and smaller due to a dire economic conditions that are currently people are facing in Iran, and those are in direct connection to the US imposed sanctions on Iran. What is evident here is that Sirkin and his co-writers and editors either deliberately erased that fact or were surprised by the skaters too much so that they kind of completely forgot about it. In the show, there's no minorities visible. This erasure is dangerous not only to the stereotypically fraught image of Iran that it produces, but also because the Iranian Jewish community and specifically their member of the Iranian parliament have been historically an advocate voice against discrimination towards all religious minorities, including Christians, Zoroastrians, and Baha'is of Iran. Analyzing the symbolic imageries that are projected to a global audience through an Israeli lens is important. Though Israel is a small country, it is one of the world's most prolific exporters of television to the United States. Iran holds a very complicated imagination in the US public. For the purpose of the time, I'll be focusing on 2 incidents of this kind of representation in the show. In these examples, I will focus on the idea of mobility, how the Israeli creators portray the Iranian nationals' mobility, and how they actually have to show, when they actually have to show the manifestation of repression, the show creators have to go back to their own, the Israelis' own violence and project it onto the imagination of Iran. In the first episode, Tamar enters Iran through Tehran's Imam Khomeini airport. Tamar and another Mossad agent are passengers on the flight from Amman, Jordan to Delhi, India. When the flight, due to a fake technical difficulty, performs an emergency landing in Tehran, Tamar and her companion comfortably pass through the gates and checkpoints on the Iranian soil and wait for the aircraft to be fixed. Tamar is wearing a burqa which covers her body and face, and the other Mossad agent is a bearded man who holds a tasbih, an Islamic prayer bead. He holds it in his hand, sorry. Their embodied image of a Muslim couple is juxtaposed to another Israeli couple who, unbeknownst to Mossad, have boarded the aircraft in Jordan. As the two Israeli citizens get taken away by the Iranian security agents, Tamar and the Mossad agent pass through the gates and blend in with the other passengers in the airport. In Tehran, Mossad agents enter Iran with no friction. Towards the end of the series, Tamar's commander decides to leave Tel Aviv for Iran to assist Tamar in her mission. Less than 12 hours later, she's at the safe house in Tehran. In contrast to this fluid mobility stands the testaments of entrapment expressed by the Iranians Tamar meets through her journey. In the show, when mobility is afforded to Iranian citizens, it is mainly to the military officials and their family. Iranians, when like Tamar, behave secularly, join artist co-ops, and go to parties in the mountain, aren't allowed the mobility afforded to her. In contrast, their secular behavior only shows their further entrapment within the Islamic Republic of Iran. On the other hand, the notion of hijab is also implied differently when its wearer is an Iranian instead of Israeli. The centrality of hijab to the espionage plot implies the violent notion that the Muslim woman embodies two identities, one under the covers of their religiously mandated rule of hijab, and one when they are free from it. This further exacerbates this entrapment of Iranian woman, making her mobility even less imaginable and than the male counterpart of her society. This uneven implication of mobility is at the expense of Iranian sovereignty, and their culture and religious beliefs are used as signifiers of their entrapment. Simultaneously, Tamar, in her disguise, treats the Iranian secular and her anti-government boyfriend like a dog. So the Iranian men don't have it much better than the woman either. In episode 5 of the show, when Tamar and her new Iranian hacker boyfriend are on their way to a rave in the mountain, they come into encounter with a checkpoint. For any Iranians that know this, the Iranian for most of Iranians who have traveled between cities, the idea of highway patrol is not an unfamiliar sight. Traffic Police of Naja is the law enforcement agency in Iran responsible for traffic enforcement and the highway patrol. Though ultimately all the police agencies can and do report to Sepah Pastaran, Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps, a branch of the Iranian armed forces, the checkpoints are not guarded by military guards. Though in spirit, the image produced in Tehran can resemble a sense of familiarity, in actuality, it represents something much darker. On the road, Tamar and her friends come to what looks like a checkpoint. On the right of the road stands a tower with a soldier in an armed force uniform with a light machine gun mounted on the edge and pointed at the road. On the ground, a soldier in the same army uniform greets the car. After looking at this image and witnessing the interaction between the police, Tamar, and her friends, one can find an eerie resemblance of that imagery and interaction in the violent Israeli border police checkpoints. Here, I don't want to argue that Iranian police, much like the police and armed forces in any other country, are exempt from criticism of the brutality and the violence they actually oppose on minorities. But I would like to look at these images as a cultural product of the Israeli creators themselves. The violence against Palestinians with the Israeli checkpoint needs no introduction. Other than the predatory notion of their existence, the open fire policy of Israeli armed forces has resulted in many assaults and death at the expense of Palestinian public. In June 23rd, only one day after the premiere of Tehran in Israel, Ahmed Erekat, a 27-year-old Palestinian and the nephew of the Saeb Erekat, Secretary General of Palestinian Liberation Organization, PLO, was murdered by the border police forces of East Jerusalem. Erekat was said to be running errands for his sister's wedding. In contrast to that rendition of traffic police in Tehran stands a 2018 short comedy skit produced by Mehran Ghafourian, an Iranian comic, called How Not to Get a Ticket. In this video, Ghafourian is pulled over by a Naja officer for not wearing a seatbelt. As the call pulls over, we hear a post-revolutionary pop music produced in the US by Hassan Shamaizadeh projecting from the car. As Ghafourian gets out of the window of the passenger seat, he physically props himself up on the shoulder of the police officer. The officer is wearing the Naja uniform that is starkly different from the military uniforms in the show. The video is then a series of negotiation between Ghafourian and the officer. He makes multiple excuses for not wearing a seatbelt, such as him being a secret police agent, pregnant, and the head of Naja's nephew. The stark difference between this interaction, itself filled with the criticism of the policing in Iran, and the one produced in Tehran are many. But what is evident is that acknowledgement that there is a difference between Iran. There's a difference in Iran between military and the border police forces. Sorry, it's important to recognize. When we're confronted with the image of the checkpoint in Tehran, it's important to recognize that imagery as produced by Israeli creators as a subconscious reflection of their apartheid state, falsely transferred to another nation. To project one's own territorial violence on a foreign enemy country is a reflection of self more than it is a representation of the other. The summer of 2020 was a tumultuous time for Iran and Iranians, as COVID-19 ravaged throughout the country, leaving many dead and the healthcare system strained beyond measures. The Iranians faced many explosions with unknown sources across the country. These explosions took place at nuclear enrichment facilities, missile sites, power plants, and medical clinics. The explosion at the medical clinics, shown here, killed 19 civilians and was a catastrophic loss for a country under crippling U.S. sanction that had made access to medical necessities needed for combating COVID-19 nearly impossible. The first explosion happened only 3 days after the TV series Tehran was released in Israel. Moshe Zander, in his interview with the New York Times about the show, referred to these explosions as the kind of publicity money can't buy. His response to the explosions that ravaged Iran was a bombing and then an episode of the show, and then another bombing, and then it kept going like that. Everyone reacted and said, "Oh, Tamar Rabinian is working." Nif Sultan, the actress who plays Tamar in the now deleted TikTok video, filmed herself as she was applying nail polish while listening to the news of explosions in Iran on the TV. She then gestured to herself, implying for the audience that Tamar could be behind those explosions. I did not spend time in this presentation arguing whether or not Israeli spies were behind those explosions, though according to New York Times, some officials say that a joint American-Israeli strategy could be behind these explosions. However, it is essential to acknowledge the stark and gleeful warmongering of Tehran and its creators when referring to real life events, the consequences of which are almost exclusively death and demise of the Iranians they claim their show represents. I also believe that the response to the bombing in Iran is not a standalone event separate from the show. As exemplified throughout this presentation, Tehran is a cultural product of a stark geopolitical time that we inhabit. And as such, the absence and erasure of the voices of Iranians who live in Iran is inherent to such production. When confronted with the show that the New York Times deems as unabashedly entertaining, as it's renewed by Apple for a second season, the question of the ways in which Iran and Iranian sovereignty are portrayed needs to be at forefront of that perception. Thank you so much. I'm sorry if I went over time.